Hello to everyone at home and welcome to the 14th edition of our New South Wales Referees Life Member Series. Tonight I'm joined by a man who has officiated 189 first grade games as a touch judge. He's officiated in Origins, Test matches and a grand final. Please welcome Barry Bolton. Barry, how are you?
I'm good, thank you, very good.
How are you doing in these strange times? What are you doing to keep yourself occupied?
I'm continuing much of what I've been doing for the last 17 years. I've been retired now for 17 years and lucky enough to have my wife with me. And we spent a lot of time together, which is great because in the days of refereeing and of course of work times, we were quite often separated, not for a lengthy period, but still separated enough to have our own work to do everything else in interest. But now we can spend that time together and catch up and have a good life, a good type of life in retirement. We tend to do it with a bit of travel, though. That's one thing we have done. We had done some travel in our earlier times, but since we're retired, we make a trip overseas at least once every year. We've been very fortunate. We've been able to afford this, and we've travelled to something like about 60 countries, I think it is now, and we've actually stood on every continent, the 7 continents of the world, which is something that, we feel quite pleased with.
Wow.
And thirdly,
No, you go on.
And thirdly, grandchildren. Never thought we were going to have any till 2011, and all of a sudden 5 arrived, 1 each successive year, and then we thought that was it, and another one arrived last year. So now we have 6 grandchildren. We have 5 grandsons and 1 granddaughter, and whenever we can spend time with them. Unfortunately, one is in Brisbane, which means we haven't been able to get up there for a while to see him. But still, that's the fact of life, and we have to accept it. But we still Skype a fair bit and go in to hang out, etc., and work there. But apart from that, that's about it. Plenty of time occupied with Jenny, doing the things we love to do. Particularly Jenny's very, very involved in family history, and she's researched our families, both our families, going way back. She runs it past me to make sure that things are right. I don't think she really listens to what I have to say, though, because she does 99% of it. But she does a hell of a lot of it.
No, it sounds like you've got plenty to keep yourself busy. And some of that travel, wow, that's amazing. Is there a particular place that you guys enjoyed the most, or is there a couple of places with really fond memories? I mean, looking at these photos, you look like you're having a blast.
We have been, as I said, to a lot of countries, and we've travelled extensively throughout Europe and the North Americas, etc. But I suppose that you tend to think of the more recent events in your life, and I've got to say, last November, December was perhaps one of the biggest and best trips we had. We had 32 days whereby we sailed down the west coast of South America and then onto the Antarctic. And that was truly a memorable trip, something that not a lot of people get a chance to do, particularly Antarctica. And having been there, well, it was really magical. And we did it, I must admit, in good style, excellent style, which made it much more comfortable, but a truly remarkable trip. We still talk about it. And we still look at the photos, and Jenny actually made 2 photo books of this particular trip, and we often pick them up and just go through and just really remember how great a trip it was.
Wow, that is absolutely fascinating. Some of the stories and the places that you have been to. So you mentioned that you were a teacher by trade. Can you tell us a little bit about what teaching was like for you before retirement? Some of the roles you had, maybe what subjects you taught?
Well, it changed. I started teaching back in 1964. It was a time when I was there, and I was at Belmore Boys High, which I never knew existed until I became a teacher. And it's not very far from Canterbury Bankstown Leys Club, just down the road. You can spot either from the other, and it's not a bad location for that reason. I had been. In my former life, I'd been a rugby union player. I hate to say it, but not because of choice, but because of necessity. The schools I went to, and they were state high schools, etc. Canterbury Boys High for a period of time. Then I transferred to East Hills Boys High, which was closer to home. And then in my teacher training, all rugby union in those days. So not by choice, but by necessity, I played rugby union. But when I went to Belmore Boys High, there I was at Belmore Boys High. And on the staff was Warren Ryan, a name that a lot of people might know. He was a sporting coach at that particular time. And playing, I think, at that stage, he'd just finished, or it might have just been finishing with St George and moved on to Cronulla when it came into the inaugural season in 1967, if memory serves me right. But, you know, I'd had a bit of contact with the people of that nature. One of the photos actually shows me as in a football team back at East Hills Boys High, and seated beside me, a lot of people might recognise this gentleman as Jack Danzy. And at that stage, I had no idea, but Jack was a PE teacher there, and there it was some 15, 16 years later, I get graded, and who's in the graded ranks? Jack Danzy. And so we reacquainted ourselves. Me as the former pupil, he is a former teacher, and it was a good way to go. And then, of course, with Warren Ryan, I got involved in the Little League in those days with him as a coach at the school. But my own career, I came back to Sydney in '64 is when I started teaching. And then what actually happened was that I was fortunate enough to make the Canterbury President's Cup side in that first year of rugby league. Was signed by Canterbury to play the next year, but never was able to fulfil that wish because of injury. I was unfortunate enough to be in a car accident fairly early. I was in training at about February, March it was, in a car accident, had a terrible whiplash and a bruised spleen and short stint in hospital, and ended up finding myself unable to play football for about 12 to 18 months. And at that particular time, Peter Moore said, I'll go back to juniors and give it a try. But, you know, it was not the thing to do because teaching was the job, because the money wasn't what it is today, of course, in football. And I realised that I needed a career which was going to sustain me. So I went back into teaching, and there I was as a teacher, and alongside Warren Ryan. And that's how, not because of Warren, but as at Belmore Boys High, and starting at that particular time and the next couple of years coaching junior league teams or school knockout teams, etc., is how I got involved with refereeing.
So you took up the whistle in the late 1960s with Canterbury referees. Can you tell us exactly why? And now you've mentioned a story to me earlier off this forum about your wife, how she also got a ticket at that time.
Yeah. I'll tell you how I actually got involved. Initially, I was like a typical player. Referees were those people, you know, that they were the enemy in one way or other. They never seemed to make a ruling that you appreciated. Never made one that was your way. You could always find fault with the referee. I mean, every time a referee puts his arm up, he only pleases half the crowd, doesn't he? And each time he puts it up, it's probably the other half he disagrees with him then anyway. But what actually happened was, as a teacher, I was put onto the schoolboys knockout committee, and I met Brian Knight. Poor fellow's passed away these days, Canterbury referee. And we used to have little discussions about referee, shall we call it, for want of a better expression. And we had those little discussions, and he made a challenge. He said, well, if you want to know about refereeing, why don't you take it up? And always one to accept the challenge. I said, right. So the following year in 68, end of 68, going to 69, Brian coached me. I was very fortunate that Jenny came with me because she loved the game. And we both were coached by Brian, and we both did the certificate at the same time down in Phillip Street, the old Phillip Street. I passed the course, as did Jenny. But the strange thing was in those days that Jenny was not allowed to have a folio number, and she still got a letter today written by Ken Stephen, who was the secretary in that day, saying that being a lady, and she didn't get a folio number, only the males got that, the men got that, and she wasn't allowed to referee, which disappointed her a little bit. And she was a little bit upset about the fact. I mean, things have changed somewhat now, haven't they? Otherwise, we could have had a referee back in about 1970, I suppose. But be it so, then she decided she'd take up coaching, would you believe, of all things, with a local rugby league side. And this is where the pain comes. She ended up winning, would you believe, three district competitions, and also won a state knockout coaching a district team. And It was incredible level of success for her. Yeah. But then she had to give that away as well for a couple of reasons. One, that she'd been coaching NM and L grade because they would not let a woman go beyond coaching L grade, because at that stage, the boys were getting too big in the dressing room to have a lady in there. So she was restricted to the NM and L, and she'd run a race pretty well there. And of course, then our own children start to come along, and that reduced her, unfortunately, I might say, to being a spectator of the sport and a follower of the sport and a supporter for me all the way through my career.
I suppose it's quite sad what the stigma and perceptions used to be back then, but thankfully they're much different these days, and for the better, of course. So you contributed a lot to your local association over the years, and you were awarded life membership of Canterbury in 1984. What were some of the contributions you made to Canterbury, and what did this recognition mean to you?
Well, the various jobs, you take on the jobs you can when time permits, because, you know, as you probably well know from teaching, that it's a pretty full-on job. You just don't knock off when the bell goes and come home. You bring a lot with you. And of course, being an English teacher in those days, I was bringing home a hell of a lot of essays and the so-called, as they used to call in the old days, the compositions from the junior classes, and a lot of marking, a lot of reading of texts, you know, to keep me ahead of what the prescribed text were required and everything else. But I served as a delegate to the Junior League for a number of years. Maybe because I had the gift of the gab somewhat, they sent me down there to talk on behalf of the referees. I also was on the judiciary. I was a judiciary board member, handling judiciary cases going through. I also unofficially attached myself to groups. I remember we used to have what they called a doubles committee in those days to raise funds. And I used to, on the way home, used to pass another friend's, a colleague's home, Peter Wallace, referee, and I used to pass his home, and I knew that every Wednesday they'd be there, the group of fellows, so they're stapling up the doubles, getting them all bundled, ready to be issued, delivered, and everything else and so forth. So I took it upon myself to stop every Wednesday afternoon there and help them do that. At the same time, then I became very interested in doing other things with the referees, and later in the time just after I'd been great at TNT, came to the league and gave sponsorship to the Senior Referees Association, the downtown one. And I wondered why this should be that the district clubs didn't have anything like this. So I took it upon myself to initiate and then chaired a committee to look after the initial gaining of a sponsorship for Canterbury Bankstown with a firm called Peerless, who provided jerseys for us, and it was Dunlop. Dunlop provided the boots, and I spent 3 or 4 years doing that as well. And then, of course, once I reached grade, I then went back to my district association and was on the advisory board there, you know, reporting on referees and giving them written reports and everything else of that nature. I wanted to be a referee. I will say this now, that in my time as refereeing, I saw people who needed to be a referee, but subtly speaking, I wanted to be a referee. I didn't need it, but I wanted it. But I must say, it did fill a void for me. The fact that I'd missed out on my chance to play upper football, I at least got eventually to be involved in that through the refereeing angle as well. The next best thing to playing, I think, is to be a referee, to be out there on that field running.
So you worked your way through the grades as mentioned, and you were graded into the New South Wales rank as member 661. How did you find out that you were graded? How were you informed? And was this a highlight for you at that stage of your career, or did you have aspirations of going further in refereeing?
It was a highlight. It was the first year that I didn't try for grade. I was sent down to try for grade by our association based on my performances within the district, I assume. And I was sent down and had 1 year running in the Jersey Flag President's Cup and all that sort of stuff competition. And at the end of that season, I didn't think much about it. And then when the gradings came out that following year, after a few trial matches and everything else, my first knowledge of it was I was at work. I was at school. I was at Sir Joseph Banks High at Revesby, if I remember rightly. And I got a phone call from Colin Turnell, a name that you might be aware of. Colin was a younger Canterbury Bankstown referee who'd been in much longer than I. Started as a junior and had been graded before I was. And Colin rang me and I got this message, and Mr. Turnell wants to speak to you. And I didn't know for what reason at that point. And Colin rang and told me that I'd been graded. And he said, "Don't you believe me?" I said, "I don't know." He said, "Well, have a look in today's paper." And that was how you found out. You saw your name printed in the sporting section of the paper as being one of the newly graded referees. My feelings were, I've got to be honest, exultation. I mean, what else can you feel? You've achieved something wonderful. You've been recognised by another body, a distinct body from your own, the Canterbury Bankstown Group, as being worthy of joining them. And there's a feeling of success. I must admit I had no feeling at that time of how high can I go. I was just so pleased that I was involved and selected to be involved in grade football, which was, something I'd always wanted to be involved in.
So who were some of the mentors or influential figures for you working your way through the grades?
Working my way through the grades, I have to say this, that it's very political refereeing. it's that there are groups you tend to associate, and I think that my mentors were primarily my fellow Canterbury Bankstown colleagues who are already graded. They naturally admitted me and they took me in that first night. I sat with them, and that's how the process sort of commences, because otherwise you're a complete stranger meeting these people from all these other districts. You might have come across a few of them in the odd trial game here and there, but primarily you don't know them. So the Canterbury Bankstown referees were primarily, I'd say, my mentors, because they had made grades. So they had been successful. So I went and sat with those people and spent time with them. But beyond them, I did have a think at some stage about some of the people that I knew at that time and over the following years. And I've got to be honest, there were not a great number of people, but some did stand out for me. There were two gentlemen in the old appointments board, as they called it, that I had a great deal of respect for, because they had very pleasant personalities. They were never vindictive or spiteful. They'd sit down, they'd talk with you, and they'd explain everything to the nth degree. Different in personalities, in terms of character personalities. And one was a fellow called Jewel, and he was a tremendous fellow from Manly. And the other was Kevin Jeffs. Kevin was a bit of a clown, loved to make things more funny and everything else and so forth. But between those two, they were the two board members that I always felt good when I had them on my board, because I knew it was going to be a pleasant experience. Even if I'd done wrong things, it was not going to be held against me. It was going to be something like, let's just talk about this, and what do you reckon? And like a teaching situation, they'd sort of discuss it and bring it out with me, and we talk about the goods, the bads, or the otherwise that might have come out of that situation. Beyond that, I can honestly say that amongst central referees, I had a few favourites that I think were beneficial. I learned a lot from watching them. And they would have been people like Les Matthews, who had been the president of Canterbury at that stage and was in grade, but he had a very short career, did a hamstring at one stage. Actually, I was there the day he did it. It was not very pleasant. And that seemed to bring Les's centre career to a full stop, because he was out for one hell of a long time and never really made it back. But two referees in particular stand out in my mind, and they were Barry Barnes from Parramatta, if memory serves me right.
I think it was from Penrith. I think Barry was from Penrith. Yes.
Oh, Penrith, was it? I knew he was out west somewhere. But anyway, Barry Barnes, and because he was a gentleman, a really quite not obvious referee. He fitted that bill of, be seen but not heard sort of thing. You know what I mean? That's the situation. But he managed to game very well, very calmly, never seemed flustered about the whole thing. And the other referee that impressed me as I worked my way through was Kevin Roberts. Poor old Kevin's passed away now. Sergeant Bilko was his nickname, because he was a sergeant in the police force in the detectives area. And Bilko was a great guy in that made mistakes on the field. I'll say that now, and warts and all, he did make mistakes on the field, but that didn't worry Kevin. Kevin went out there with that attitude that I have about that fairness. And you can see that Kevin, having been an ex-player, which I think is somewhat beneficial to being a referee, not necessarily, but beneficial. He had a good way with players, and he had an authority that they respected, they understood. And he taught me, or I learned from watching him, that, if you are authoritarian without being abrupt, without being abusive, without acting tough, but just with the tone of the voice and the mannerisms indicate that I'm in charge, this is what must be, etc. That was very significant to me as well. Apart from that, touch judging wise, I had a few friends that I came across, and again I must mention Brian Wiseman, a great touch judge as far as I'm concerned. He helped a hell of a lot in my career, ran a couple of lines with him here and there and some finals, etc.
In the late 1970s, you were plying your trade in the lower grades as a referee. You make your first grade debut as a touch judge in the round 4 match of the 1978 season at North Sydney, in a game between North and St George. So at this point, you still very much have your sights set on doing your referee apprenticeship and making your way to first grade. Can you talk to us a little bit about the next period of your career refereeing in reserve grade and first grade trials?
Yeah, I think that appointment you're referring to might have been a little bit of a reward, or even to test me to see how I might go in the top grade. I'd been up in reserve grade doing some touching at that stage, and all of a sudden I got this, and just the one-off, but it just came out of nowhere. Much appreciated, great experience, and something worth remembering. And then, of course, I pursued my career a little bit more in the centres after that, and came to the centres after that. Did my penance, you might say, in the third grades, under 23s they were called, I think towards the end of that time, and then into reserve grade. And there I was in reserve grade there, and travelling, I thought, probably like most of us feel, quite well at that stage, and doing, I hoped, a good job, and seemingly so, because I maintained that position there. And then in 82 came the changing year of my refereeing career. Beginning of the year, I was called upon to run trial matches in first grade. And it was most significant to me that this was great. Now I felt all of a sudden, and that's probably first felt the fact that I could be going even higher and doing something really significant, because the jump from reserve grade to first grade was not a microcosm, was a bit of a bigger step than the others had been. And I thought, gee, this is good. And I'm doing these first grade trials. And I did the first grade trials. And then I was sent back for the first round of the competition, late February, I think it was, to reserve grade. But with the idea, having spoken to the board members, that, well, when a vacancy occurs and the time is right, you could be dragged up to first grade. And I felt quite good about that, and quite hopeful about the whole thing. But then the world turned upside down. And it happened in that very, very first reserve grade match of that season. I was in the centre, and I was refereeing Newtown versus Eastern Suburbs, or the Roosters as they're called. And I found that there was an incident of the match happened in back play. I didn't see it, had no idea what had happened. It happened back just within the Eastern Suburbs, within their half area, and the game then flowed up field and came to a stop with me awarding a penalty to East directly in front of the post against Newtown. Then all of a sudden, I've got touch judges in, and the touch judges told me there's an incident back play, and a fellow had been knocked over back there. There he is up there, and I could see him sitting on the ground. He's sitting up at the stage being attended to. And I got the information from the touch judges, and I've got to be honest, not having seen it, you weigh it all up and you think about it. And I thought, well, I've got a penalty here right under the post to East. It's better than going back up there and thinking about doing anything about that one. The fellow was up on his feet by this stage and walking around, so I thought that looked all right to me. And I continued on with the game, having cautioned Rodonicus, who was the man that they indicated had come in, and allegedly hit him a bit high and a bit late, etc. And I hadn't seen anything at all, so it didn't seem suspicious at that time anyway for me to say, anything other than you're penalised, you just keep yourself out of trouble, and the game will be all right for you and for me and everybody else. I came off the field at the end of the game. The appointments board member spoke to me, and in those days, if memory serves me right, you got one of three results: a good, a pass, or a fair. A good meant that was you were on top of the game. A pass meant no troubles, no dramas. A fair meant, oh, we've got to think about you. I was given a pass, which I was quite happy. Okay with me. It was a verbal report in those days, totally verbal, nothing written whatsoever, just given a verbal report. Came home, went to bed, it was a Saturday, got up in the morning, there were the newspapers, Eastern Suburbs complaining about game. Ernie Garland was the name of the hooker, by the way, that had been hit. Ernie Garland has broken jaw, Eastern Suburbs upset Eastern, and I must say Eastern Suburbs held a lot of sway in those days. Roosters still might hold a similar amount of sway, I suppose. And in that particular situation, I thought, oh, well, that's not all that good after all. He might have got him a bit better than I thought he got him, the way I was told. Anyway, the next thing I know, the phone rang and my wife answered it, and it was the board member from the previous day. And that board member asked me, did I see the reports? I said, yes, I had. And then he said, well, I'm going to tell you now, I'm changing your report to a fair. And I said, well, I don't think that is very fair, I said, because, yesterday you saw the game, you saw everything that happened, you gave me a pass, and now after we see the reports and the hoo-ha within the newspaper, you want to change it to a fair? And he said, yes, it's a fair. So the fair came out, I wore it, I found myself in third grade the next week. So I'd gone from a first grade trialist week 1 to a third grade referee 2 weeks later. I wasn't happy, as you can probably understand, thinking, wow, that's a bit rough. But that was part of the culture of refereeing in those days, because there was something, if I ever get a chance to talk to you about it, the culture of refereeing. I will. But the thing is that I was not happy with it, but I wore it. I said, okay, they want to do this, they can do it, but I'll just keep refereeing. Continued on for about 3 or 4 weeks and thought, no, something's wrong here. And being the person who likes to improve things if I can, I thought maybe there's a way to change this. And having been on the advisory board at Canterbury and having written fairly copious reports on the referees, I thought, why can't we get a written report? So because I didn't like the idea of it being changed verbally and overnight and no one knowing who, what, how or when, etc. So I stood up at a meeting downtown and asked, could it be possible that a written report be given? I was asked why by the front desk, and I suggested that, well, maybe it's a good thing that you can walk away with something in your hand, even if it's just a little slip of paper with your name on it, the grade and the signature of the board member. That'd be it. I was told it was a difficult job that would not be able to be done by the board. They had too many things to do, and that was it. I accepted that, sat down. As I was leaving that meeting that night, I was requested by a senior referee that I should confront the board on the following Monday night. They expected me to be down there. So as I was leaving the room, I sort of stood and thought for a moment, and a fellow called Terry Murphy, who was a great referee, a solicitor of those days, now a judge somewhere, I believe. He said, "What's wrong, Barry?" And I said, I've just been told I've got to front the board. And at that point, the president, Don McDonald, walked by, who was a close friend of Terry's. And Terry called him over and we had a quick talk. And Don and Terry said, "Look, we'll come down with you, we'll see what's going on." So I went down the following week to the board. Terry and Don were not allowed to come in. I was taken in. The whole board questioned me about why I was asking such things, etc. and so forth. Said that I should now go out next week and consider myself, and these were, I'm paraphrasing, consider myself somewhat lucky and keep my nose clean. And that was the end of that meeting, I thought, and that was it. I was appointed the next week and I had the same board member who had changed his report on me, and somehow or other he came up with another fare for me on that particular week, claiming that I had cost one team the game on a decision I made in the first half of the game. I was quite distressed by it all, and a certain other board member made a suggestion that maybe I should quit at that stage, give it up, but don't cop this. And I thought, no, being competitive, I'll hang in there. So I decided I'd hang in there, and I hanged in, and consequently, I finished where I did with quite a good record, I hope, a reasonable good record anyway, as a touch judge. But that was a changing of my career, going from being a hopeful centre man to, I hope, a very distinctive and qualified and good touch judge.
I think you certainly became that. I think out of adversity, good things can come. So moving on to the touchline, you've had an absolutely tremendous career full of highlights, including Panasonic Cup finals, City Country, State of Origin, Test matches, and a grand final. The first of these major appointments comes in 1983, when you're appointed to State of Origin, Game 2. I think it was at the SCG from memory. Do you remember being informed of the appointment, and what were the emotions leading up to the game and the experience itself?
The feelings are incredible. You're probably going to ask me, what are the greatest matches I've done? I've always got to say that the State of Origins have a particular emphasis in my mind, because each level of the game and each area of the game has its own charisma. I mean, first grade is something, State of Origins is something different again, Test match is something different again, Panasonic Cups, whatever it might be. These are all things which, they have a bearing on what you might do. If I remember rightly, that match was, I think, was that the one I did at Lang Park, though, with Gomersall as the referee?
I think that was later on. I think that was 87 with Gomersall. I think the first one was John Gosher at the SCG.
Could have been. I know I did. I thought I did 2 up in Queensland.
Yeah, you did. You did Game 3 in 87 and then Game 3 in 89 with Greg McCallum.
That's right. Yeah, that's now you do. It does ring a bell with me, because I remember when I was awarded the Blazer by Canterbury, it didn't have State of Origin on it. Not just a small point. It was New South Wales versus Queensland, because the State of Origin had not long been going at that stage, and I don't think the enthusiasm for the word State of Origin had really grown anywhere else except in Queensland. But you're right, yeah. But I do remember that's right, the cricket ground. It was a great thrill. You've got to be saying, you've got to believe, that you've done something really well, and you've got to appreciate the fact. And I mean, it's like everything else. Like when you, as you know, in teaching, when you reward a child, and you see the delight on their face, and you see that emphasis that goes into their next piece of work, how they think, well, gee, I've done well, I'll try and do better, and keep the pleasure coming my way. It was like that for me. And the state of and the cricket ground, I've got to say, was a distinct ground too. I mean, that's something that perhaps we need to think about, the grounds. Each ground was so different. The atmosphere was incredible. I know the grounds where the crowds on the sideline are significant, but the old cricket ground had some particular echo about it, some particular ring about it. And having been trained not only in English but history, which I never got to teach much of, there was a great history about the old cricket ground. And when you came out of the old change room up there and you walked down through the members' stand and everything else, there was something about the vibes of that atmosphere was a little bit more special, a little bit more distinct than from some other grounds where you come out of a tunnel and you're out on the field all of a sudden. You actually walk through the crowd there, as you did in the old Lang Park. But there's a story there I could tell you too, if you want to hear it as well. But that coming out on that cricket ground was something really special, because that was the hallowed turf, was it not, for New South Wales? I mean, we didn't have the stadium at Homebush there. We didn't, and the old Sydney Football Stadium, or now old, at that stage was the old sports ground, which was an abomination of ground. Ran from east to west, you had the sun in your eyes, everything else like that. But that cricket ground had something special about it. And I do remember distinctly, now you're right, that was something really special, that match where, it was my first big appointment, I think, even beyond that first grade in back in 78, because I think that one was, I knew that was a trial to see how I'd go, but being appointed to this particular one, and probably more so because of the disappointments of 82.
Yep. So here's your chance. You can talk about that story about Lang Park. So you did your first one at the SCG, and you said that was special for different reasons. I'm sure Lang Park as an atmosphere and the cauldron and the ferocity of the fans there would have been just as special for different reasons again.
Yeah, Lang Park was a different ground. In those days, depending on which match it was, they'd send up a centre referee from New South Wales. And actually, they all came from New South Wales, and a touch judge from Queensland would officiate with the New South Wales touch judge. Queensland got a bit testy about how the New South Wales referees appear to be somewhat biased against them. That old cockroach versus, what are they called, McCain toads, etc. Yep. And I remember that I was appointed to the match with Gomersall. Now, I do not intend to denigrate the man, but he came from, I think, from Townsville or Rockhampton or something, up that way, and he'd been refereeing there, which was a little bit akin to refereeing in the districts, the country districts of New South Wales, be it something like Dubbo or Coffs Harbour or that, a bigger town, no doubt. But it was not quite the standard of football that you see in the city and so forth. And what I found about refereeing with poor old Barry was that he didn't have that recognition of his touch judge's presence. He took it upon himself to look after everything, and consequently, if he didn't see it or didn't know anything about it, and that what you saw was somewhat irrelevant. And I remember there's an incident between Dowling and Sterling, where I came in to report the fact that Dowling had punched Sterling after Dowling had played the ball. And Queensland, of course, ran over and scored a try. And when I came in, he's there standing over the try spot, and he said, "You win over that blue back there?" I said, "Yeah, I want to let you." "Don't worry," he said, "I've got it." I said, "Oh, good, I'll stand here and give you my report anyway." He called the skippers over, told them to be careful. They were playing for an Australian jersey, everything else. They didn't do the right thing, that sort of stuff, and keep their players quiet. And it's going to be a try here. And I'm still standing there, not having given my report, which was going to be that Sterling tackled him. And when Dowling got up, he decided to punch Sterling. And I went to report the attacking player as punching a defending player, but never got to do it. But the other thing I noticed as well up there was on that particular ground, again, that same ground, if memory serves me right, at half time when we left, I was coming in and I was behind the others because I come on the other side of the field, and they being Queenslanders, it just went. And there was not that sort of camaraderie where you stick together and escort each other off the field. And I was about 10 paces behind them as I got to the gate. And as you get to the gate on the old Lang Park, there was a tier of seats there. behind which was a concourse, behind which was the grandstand where the dressing room was. And there were two gentlemen in maroon blazers holding up chains to keep the crowd from traversing that concourse and let the referees through. Gomersville got through. I think it was Groner, the other fellow, got through as well. And I was about 5-6 paces behind. As I came, they dropped the chain and the crowd just went. They just went to get to their beers and everything else. And I had to, in a sense, fight my way through the crowd to get into the dressing room. It was just a matter of look after yourself, cockroach, you'll be all right, sort of thing. And the other thing was that northeastern corner of the old Lang Park, should say, was the equivalent of what we might call the Hill in Sydney here. And if you were involved in incidents like with the Dowling situation or some other incident in Queensland, and you were up in that corner and the crowd didn't like what you'd done, or didn't like it because you were a New South Wales anyway, they'd throw things at you. And I remember being at one stage there, standing there being hit by coins, you know. They were actually throwing coins, dollar coins at me and hitting me on the back and everything else. And a couple, you know, whizzed past my ear. Cans came my way, bottles came my way. And the officials around the ground would just sort of wander over and pick up the bottles and cans and kick me into the gutter, and the game goes on. But it was quite a dangerous corner in which to stand.
So you officiated in a time of great toughness in the game. There were lots of big brawls in the early 1980s, and you were on the line for one of the biggest in particular. At the SCG, it was a match between South and St George in a semi-final of 1984. We might just have a look here and listen to some of the vision and audio. But then can you talk to us a little bit about what goes through your mind as a touch judge when there's such chaos of spot fires everywhere all over the ground?
Just cut down to Jura. Good tackle by the full-back. It had to be. Haddock, win, trouble for South. Johnston, hammering tackle from Harrington.
There's an altercation in the back play, and Barnes' real play on there, and no South Sydney players in defence.
Well, this is shades of Lang Park. In fact, there are three altercations over on the right, and on the left now it's erupted there too. I'll tell you what, you need very wide-angle binoculars to see it in one go. That's what's happening on the right. Now this is what's happening over on the left. In the meantime, it's still going on the right. They've gone again. I thought it had been quenched, but it hasn't. They're throwing lefts and rights. Mario Fennick, Graham O'Grady, Hardy. Well, I'll tell you what. There's only now 5 players left on the field of play. They're still fighting and the crowd is booing. Well, if that was the preliminary, I'll tell you what, the main event will be a nice old Donnybrook. And if you're watching Ron McAuliffe, yes, you're right. I think that was worse than Lang Park.
So there's scenes we're not accustomed to seeing these days. How do you handle that as a touch judge when you're literally outnumbered? You've got a blue you're sorting out on the ground, and then you've got another one taking place behind you.
Yeah, initially I was by myself on that far side. The battles had started on the near side near the member stand, and Ian and Barry were over there sorting out what was nice, and all of a sudden it erupted. But as a touch judge, what you do is you try to watch the field. I mean, it's a pity that you are a touch judge in one way, because in a sense you don't see the game. You're always that one pass or two behind, and you're just watching what's going on, and you're even watching. Sometimes I've been standing on halfway while the try's been scored on the other end of the field, because you've got to watch what's happening at that halfway between 2 or 3 players might be at each other. But what you do is you stand back, you watch, you try to envisage who's doing what, who, if you can, see who's starting it, who's involved in it. But you've got to be sure you pick up those who come running in particular, because they're the true antagonists, the ones who come from afar with the intention of joining in. There are those who come in to try to help stop, but there are those you can sense, he's coming in to have his dig as well. And you try to make sure of all of them. And then you get yourself involved in what you think is the situation. You try to get close. You use your best school teacher voice, if you understand, and try to get them to separate. Try not to touch them, because touching them, if you put your hand in them, those liable to swing around and hit you as well. But you just stay close enough so they can hear you. You scream in their ear and tell them to break away. And then if you become aware, as I did in that instant there, that two others that started a little bit more to the left, and then they were coming from all sides, and then the original fighters came over and joined. I think we had the whole 26 involved there at one stage. And but you stand back and you try to observe as much as you can, but get close to groups to break them up as you can. And you do have some success with your voice. When you have that success, you try then to move on to the next group, and so forth to keep them apart. But they were tough old days, and there was a lot of animosity between clubs and players in those days, which you don't seem to see today, I think. I'm not saying it was bad either. In some ways, I think the crowd enjoyed it. I've got to say we didn't, because when you had to go down to judiciary, you had to sit there for a number of hours to argue over cases like that where 4, 5 or 6 players may have been sent off. You know, you've got to sit there for a good length of the night trying to differentiate between players, remember who came what. But one thing you've got to do too, I might add, is try to identify players. And I always live by the philosophy, never go by name, because familiarity breeds contempt. I always tried numbers. I'd be number 9, that sort of thing in his ear. And I'd pick out numbers, and I always try to remember numbers. And numbers are quite easier to recognise on a field than a face sometimes, or who it is that might be fighting, because they're all wearing the same gear. But the one thing, apart from eye colour and everything else like that, I suppose, and hair colour, is the number. The number does stand out. So you try to ensure you pick up the numbers of those you need to and want to talk about to the referee.
So abuse is something that we don't condone and often leads to referees giving it away, particularly young referees nowadays. You were involved in a report where Steve Roach was reported for abusing you on the line. In a position where you would hear so much of what goes on and what's said on the sidelines, where did you draw the line as a touch judge in terms of when you'd alert the referee to further action needing to be taken? So being at the top level, I'm sure there was a bit more tolerance for what was said, but where did you draw the line in terms of, no, that's direct abuse, there's something needs to be said here?
Well, it's not easy to do it, to say words. I suppose I won't say it was offensive. I've been called many things as a touch judge, in particular, and as a referee, but the language never bothered me so much. It was the attitude and the tone and the image. Again, I said I got a lot out of teaching in my refereeing, and I remember distinctly that as a teacher, it always looked bad if a child was standing a teacher up. And particularly as a head teacher and a deputy principal, and I moved around the school a lot, that was one thing I was always offended by myself, that if a child was, and the teacher could be wrong, and I accept that, and then quite often the teacher was wrong, but to have a child stand there and berate a teacher, or to say things to a teacher which were offensive, etc. and so forth, that offended me in terms of what I thought of my profession. No, respect, respect, respect. And the same attitude applied on the field as well, that if I saw a player say or do something which I thought was offensive and particularly was obvious to the crowd in particular, that he was having a say and, well, perhaps getting away with it and doing something that took away the respect and the dignity of the referee and the authority of the referee, that's when I'd report them. And I mean, I did it on a number of occasions. I remember with Blocker Roach, he was having a tough game, not going so well. He'd been penalised a couple of times, and he came back and started making comments to me about, what was I doing on the line? Was I, something blind and everything else and so forth, and persisted with it to the point that he'd lost interest in the game and was annoying me and distracting me. And at the same time, the crowd was behind, was in a corner. It was in the south eastern corner of the old City football stadium, I remember rightly. And the crowd was sort of getting into the whole thing. And I could see the crowd was now getting enthused about attacking referees. And I thought, this is wrong. So he'd been in trouble. So I went in and reported him again. And there was a photo in the paper of us walking off the field. And he was having a go at Neil Armand about how he was the son of a such and so, etc. And pointed around to me and made a comment about me as well, about being blind and that sort of thing. But I mean, it wasn't the personal offence. It was rather that lack of respect that indicated to the crowd that we were not in control of the game, because I always believed that the referee should be in control of the game. The referee has to appear to be the person who is making the decisions, not the players, because when the players appear to be making the decisions, it's it denigrates the referee's position, I feel, quite heavily.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good way of putting it. I think it's not the foul language, but when it becomes disrespectful or personal, that's probably where the line needs to be drawn. In 1984 and 1988, you officiated in Great Britain Lions Test matches here in Australia. What were these experiences like for you? You touch judged for a New Zealand referee, Ray Shrimpton, and then the French referee, Francis Desplat, and you actually did the 100th test between Australia and Great Britain. What were your memories of these experiences?
Yeah, they were always somewhat social events in that you were always they always found time to get you to meet the referees and do something with them. And I remember Ray Shrimpton, he was brought in. I must have been on most of the new runs or the new trials, I think, but he was brought in when England had complained about the fact that that Australian referees were not doing the right thing, etc., and they would like a neutral referee. And they found Ray Shrimpton. Now, again, you can quote me or not, I don't care, but I believe he came from what would be equivalent to a county or something in New Zealand, not from Auckland, something, but a county area. And Ray displayed this by one particular thing, or two things actually, but one was that before the match he spoke to Vincey Smith and myself. He said, now there's one thing I want you to do, fellas. When the game starts, stand on the 10-metre line. Now, we'd always been trained and taught and realised the best place was to stand down on the corner post so that you could see the whole field to start with, but also make decisions about whether someone caught the ball with their foot over the dead ball line, blah, blah, everything else. You can't do that from the 10-metre line, can you? But he wants it. And I said, well, Ray, we don't do that. And is there a good reason? He said, oh, yeah, there's a good reason, because the grounds are so muddy back home, he said. There's so much mess. We can't even see where the 10 line is. So our touchies mark it for us to make sure the ball goes 10. Vince and I said, well, we'll go back. I think you'll be able to see the 10-metre line on the Sydney Cricket Ground. And so we went back to 10. And the other thing, poor old Mr. Shrimpton he was not the fittest referee, and he struggled a little bit, the poor fella. And we had to give him a bit extra time at half time to get ready for the second half. He needed that bit of extra time to get out there, because he said, God, it's bloody fast, isn't it? And we said, yeah, they're moving all right, aren't they? Because he'd been used to refereeing like a county type level of football or something or other. Bogged down, I suppose, in the mud as well. But it was an interesting experience. But he's a nice guy, a very nice guy. But, he found it a little bit difficult coming up that level. Desplas, very nice fellow. Now, I'll tell you a small secret. I did learn French when I was at school myself. Okay. But my French was taught to me by an Asian teacher, and therefore I had an Asian accent in my French. And it's failed me since, even in my trips to Europe. I still had trouble pronouncing some things in French. I apparently say it with a bit of an Asian twang or something or other. But be it so, he was a lovely fellow, spoke very, very, very little English, was dependent a hell of a lot on his touchies to help him, and we did a lot of talking from the sideline to players. As the game came your side, he'd be saying, he'd be giving the signal, because the signals are somewhat universal. You can understand what he's trying to do, and not yell out, as would Vince, off him, come, he wants you clear, etc. Things like that. You do a lot of talking from the sideline to the players to let them know you're there to start with, so they're aware someone is watching them, which is significant, I think, because they sometimes forget that there is a lot of people watching them, particularly officials, and we did that to help him out. But a very nice guy, and I'll tell you a little story. He came to our place here where I live at Peakhurst for a little bit of a party. That before he went back home, and Jenny and I put on a little barbecue. And we had some people here. Mick Stone was here, I remember, and Les Matthews, a few others, and we imbibed a little, shall we say, to the point that he had to go to the airport. The only person capable of really getting in the car and driving to the airport was Jenny. So thankfully, she drove him to the airport while the rest of us somewhere or other packed up here. And I don't know how the others managed to get it. We weren't bad. We were all like, oh my God, we've been drinking, and got to get him to the airport. And the only person who hadn't been drinking was Jenny. She's not a great drinker. That's why I married the girl. I could buy her a bottle of wine. It'll last all night, But she drove him to the airport, which was, I thought, quite interesting at that point of time.
So another rugby league experience you had, which we don't have these days either, is the Panasonic Cup finals. You touch judged 2 of these cup finals. How did you find these experiences with the jam-packed nature of the football calendar back then? They say there's lots of games nowadays, but you were doing games on the weekends and then games during the middle of the week.
Yeah, I look, as I said to you earlier, I wanted to referee. So I didn't need the job. I wanted it. I wanted to be out there doing something. So any appointment was a pleasure. It was a joy. I was involved. I was doing what I loved, being involved in that particular game. So the only difficulty that presented to me, the midweek ones, was as a teacher. I come back to that quite often, I know, but as a teacher, when you had to be, home supposedly getting things ready for the next day and so forth, and getting home a little bit later than you might like to, and still having to mark a few essays to finish off that pile to take in the next day, etc. All those sort of things did impact upon me, but not to the point that it bothered me. I did enjoy it, I liked it, and I wanted to do it. So the enthusiasm of wanting overcame any problems I had with backing up at any stage whatsoever. And the quality in those games was quite good. They were highly competitive. I mean, the teams were definitely out there to win because there was value in them winning. And there was a great experience for a lot of people too involved in that game. And a lot of young fellows got their chance to come up in the grades and show their wares on those midweek matches because, some of the senior players had been injured on the weekend, etc. And it was difficult for them to back up in the midweek themselves. I think the players had a bigger problem backing up than we did. But that fact I wanted to referee, it never meant a problem to me to have to back up. If they wanted me to run 6 days a week, allowing for what I could do in terms of needs for a family and home and job, etc., I would have done it, I'm sure, because it was an exciting and wonderful period of my life, and was filling that void of not being able to play myself anymore. And the good thing was, as I got older, I was still able to be out there on that paddock because as you get older as a footballer, you've got to give it away. The body tells you, but my body could last a lot longer as a referee in a touch judge than it could as a player.
Yep. And they were a little bit different, the Panasonic Cup games. They used to announce each player as they'd come out one by one, and even the referees got their own introduction.
That's true, yes.
So 1990 was another successful year for you. You touch judged the City Country match at the SFS with Greg McCallum, as we can see on screen. But then maybe one of the pinnacles of your career, you get appointed to the first grade grand final of 1990 between Canberra and Penrith. Can you talk a little bit about the week leading up to the game and then the game itself? Now, prior to this, you'd done reserve grade and third grade grand finals in 84, 85, 86, 87 and 88. So you're quite familiar to grand final day.
Yeah, but first grade is different because it's the pinnacle of the grade matches, no doubt. I mean, everybody, you only have to pick up the newspapers and read. I mean, you don't find a great deal about third grade or reserve grade, etc. It's that first grade that matters to everybody. That's the talking point. That's the game in which the whole season is judged, I suppose, in many ways. The thing I noticed about it was a hectic week, a very, very hectic week, because you are invited to attend various functions. And thankfully, at that stage, I had an excellent boss at my school who allowed me to go because you attend a variety of functions. You go to a breakfast, you go to a luncheon, you go to other meetings with groups of people, and it's just one hectic week. And I fitted in a little bit of teaching somewhere in that week. I don't know how much. I probably got back in time to make sure I got my 12th year classes taught and things like that. But I didn't turn up at school every day first thing in the morning, and sometimes left around about lunchtime, etc., to attend these functions. But a very, very hectic week. And you're aware of the fact that the spotlight is on you. I mean, even within my job and my district, etc., people were saying, "Oh, the grand final! The grand final! And that's all the talk. And you're in the midst of this, and you're part of it. And it's a very hectic, a very thrilling part of time. And it's all condensed into that one week. Whereas something like the Test match, there's a build-up, but it all happens on the day in comparison. But the grand final is a week's event. It's a whole week. Everyone's talking about it, from the last whistle on the last final match that determines who is the next team into the grand final. And it's just a talking point anywhere and everywhere you go in the rugby league world. But a very hectic period of time that was. And I remember I thought to myself, am I going to survive this week? But I was quite thrilled, quite excited. And I said, because I wanted to referee, I was quite prepared to do what I had to do to be there.
I think this next bit comes back to your love of refereeing, and as you said multiple times, wanting to referee rather than needing to referee. Now, most people won't know, you also did the Metropolitan Cup Grand Final that same year. A bit of a contrast And this shows the dynamics in rugby league and refereeing, going from 45,000 people to at the SFS to essentially park football. How did you find this as a contrast?
Well, again, I've got to say it didn't bother me, but there was a contrast. You've got to recognise that contrast. I mean, when it's like when you sometimes are appointed to a match that's not the match of the week, sort of thing. One of the lesser lights where everyone knows it's going to be like a 50-0 runaway win or something, and more so when it's in a lower grade in particular. But still, that match deserves your attention. That match deserves your effort. I mean, you don't, or you shouldn't turn off because it's a lesser match, if we can call it that. Because to those players, it's significant. To those players, it's important. To them, it's a big part of their life. Some of those players today will be able to sit back and tell their grandchildren, oh, well, you know, I was in the Panasonic Cup final, everything else like this. And I was in the Metropolitan Cup final, all these. And that to them is a meaningful thing. That's the level they reached. It's like the fellows who, you know, they might have played only A grade, but if they made an A grade and won an A grade grand final, that's their pinnacle. And so to them, it's important. And as I said, I know I keep coming back to teaching, but you know, when you teach, every kid's important to me. I mean, even the little buggers that you want to kick in the backside and throw away sometimes, you've got to recognise that they're part of that deal. They're on the field, and you've got to do something to ensure that they stay on the field and they get the best out of what they can on that field. And so to turn up for those matches, I mean, you do notice a difference. You do notice the quality of performance. You do know the quality of presentation. I mean, there's no big brass band. There's no great amount of flag waving, and the dressing rooms are probably a little bit more primitive and everything else. But the role is still that function, that you are there to give those people the best you can to ensure that they will remember their big experience of that particular day. It is a significant time for them, and I found that so. And I did one other similar match. I might have told you I'm credited with having done 2 internationals. Actually, I've done 3 internationals, because not long after I did that second test match, Great Britain versus Australia, I was appointed to a match at Henson Park. Now, we all know what Henson Park looks like, that great big massive round oval, open to the skies. King George, I think it's the 5th grandstand, if memory serves me right, sitting up on the hill there. It almost looks quite minuscule amongst the rest of the ground. But I was appointed to a New Zealand versus Australia test match for the deaf. And there would have been not many people there. And a lot of the people there, more than 2/3 of the people there, were deaf. And so there was little talk around the ground. And it was quite a fascinating game to be at. But again, for them, I can still remember they were so proud. They were wearing the Australian Guernsey, the New Zealand Guernsey. And they were so pleased with the whole thing, and they went out there and they tried their hardest, and why shouldn't I try and make their day a good day?
So like all referees, you enjoyed the social aspect of refereeing. Your wife, Jenny, and yourself often hosted pre-season barbecues. The social calendar was very important back then. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
It was, because it was a different time, I suppose. You mean I talk particularly about the 70s and the 80s, because my social life with the referees has diminished somewhat since '91. But it was a different time, a different era. I mean, what we're doing right now didn't exist. I mean, Zooming was, you know, that was something in the Netherlands yet to come at some stage or other. And there was a real camaraderie that I detected amongst referees. When I first joined referees, I noticed this. They always felt that they were the put upon ones, you know, that, oh, no one likes us, sort of thing. And I remember Brian Knight saying that to me, no one likes referees. And I thought, well, that doesn't matter. But because of that, though, became a closeness. As a referee, you became very, very close to your colleagues, very close. And you were prepared to support them through thick and thin. It didn't matter what. I mean, you had to have something to go by. And of course, in those days, social activities were rather restricted. A lot of younger members wouldn't recognise what I'm talking about now, but a lot of Saturday nights, the best place to be was the local Lees Club, where a group of referees would go and they'd have a table booked, and you'd order jugs of beer and bourbon and cokes for your missus or something like that. And they'd have a performer there, a lookalike Elvis or something of that nature. And that was your entertainment, and you get up and have a dance during the night. And the referees fill their their empty moments with those sort of days. And we had a great social life then, with barbecues at people's places. You could always drop in and see someone and have a meal, and you have friends that you go to and take your kids to. We had picnics. They still have them, I know, but I feel that there was a greater appetite for them in those days, because there was a time when the enjoyments of today were not there. There were no smartphones. I mean, people weren't wandering around reading smartphones all the time, bumping into people. People were aware of other people, and entertainment was a little bit restricted. I'm not saying totally, but somewhat restricted. And you know, the biggest things to do were to go to such functions as theatre shows and things of that nature. And the referees latched onto a lot of those sort of things to provide entertainment. And it was good to have someone organise your social events for you, because then you had somewhere to go and something to do of a weekend or wherever it might be. But
so you mentioned some leading touch judges earlier. You mentioned some names. Your career coincided with a great cross-section of touch judges at various points in their career, like Vince Smith, Ian McCall, Brian Wiseman, Mick Ryan, and many, many more. Who were some of the names that you really enjoyed running with?
for different reasons, I will say Brian Wiseman was probably one of the greatest ones I refereed with. Earlier days, I did a few lines with Les Matthews. I found that quite good. There were other touchies, though, that I enjoyed time with. They were good fellows. John Blomfield, I should say, from Cronulla. Bomber was a fantastic guy to run with. He would always make you laugh. I mean, you'd be behind the post waiting for that moment, that auspicious, when you're going to raise the flags, particularly if the score was like 9-10, and this kick was going to make it 11-10 or something. And Bomber would make some little smart crack and he'd break you up, and you had to sort of stand there and try to, hey, get yourself back on task, Bolton, forget about Bomber. But he was a lovely guy to be with and a great guy to run with for that reason. Don't think Bomber ever made great heights, but maybe because some people thought he was too relaxed and casual, but a lot of fun to run with, a great guy, and I enjoyed his company a hell of a lot. Vincey Smith was a very capable man, but he was a very worried man about running sometimes. He used to get so nervous about things, and I used to spend a little bit of time trying to calm Vincey down. He was always sort of, you know, this is it. And we ran a couple of big games together, and Vince, I think, was probably the most nervous person in the room. And you would have thought that Vince was going to be out there playing for his life or something or other, but he'd always come good. But you know, he'd enter the game with that. He probably worked on that nervous tension, I think, that some people work on. They, you know, if they feel nervous, they feel a little bit upset or distressed, they do that. Another fellow I like to run with, and both as a centre man in some ways, not that he did a lot of games with him there, but I did do some lines with him, Doug Winton from Cronulla. Doug's older than I. Doug was in grade before I, but Doug was one of those calm, cool and collected guys. Always, I had a great deal of respect for Doug, and I still hold Doug in high regard because he is the voice of reason as far as I'm concerned. And he always speaks in that deliberate, slow tone, no matter what the conversation is about. And he just slows everything down, and you listen. You're forced to listen because of that the pace of his speech. It is incredible, clear, concise, and very deep voice, and an impressive man. Of course, he's quite tall, and I used to love running with Doug as well.
Now, away from the field, you became a life member of our great association in 1993. What did this recognition mean to you?
Oh, it meant a lot, I suppose, because each step, everything you do in life, there's a progression in my mind. If you don't progress, you've not improved. You've got to always achieve or aim for something higher. Good enough is not good enough in my mind. You've got to go a little bit higher. And as a teacher, I was a bit like that. I was always castigated by some of my students because I never gave a 20 out of 20 for an essay, particularly in the senior years. And they'd say, you never give a 20. And I said, because I've yet to find the perfect essay. I mean, I might give 19, and sometimes I gave a 19 and a half, but I could always find in 5-6 pages of writing some grammatical error or some spelling mistake or something, or just the expression could have been a little bit better, and I could make a comment. And I'd always be able to say, well, see, if this was a perfect piece of writing, if those faults were not there, you'd get your 20. And the same thing, I feel, applied to refereeing, you know, that you wanted to always go a bit further. And that was the challenge I was getting students to do, try harder so you don't make mistakes. With me, when I got my life membership of the New South Wales referees, I thought, well, hang on, mate. Now, what more can you do? Because, you know, you've become a life member, so your peers, the recognition by your peers at the best level you can be at, which is the grade level, that's got to mean something which is above and beyond other things. And even, I've got to say, above and beyond Canterbury Bankstown, because Canterbury Bankstown is a select group, whereas, and all living within the same geographical region, etc. and so forth, whereas you come to grade and they come from all over, and they come from interstate and everything else. And if you can reach the pinnacle there and your peers accept you as being worthy of holding that rank amongst them, it's hard to beat. It's something which is very special, and I take great pride in wearing my life members blazer. I try to wear it every year, but I'm worrying now that with coronavirus, I might not be able to fit into it for the end of the year functions. But I'll work hard at doing something. Got to be competitive.
Now, before we finish with our Fast Five either or, I've been asking life members about the game and what it's given them. So what's the biggest benefit that rugby league has given Barry Bolton, whether it be on the field or off the field?
It's got to be satisfaction. It's got to be satisfaction because of the fact that, you know, you've spent your life doing things in life, and everything is satisfaction, whether it be you become a parent, you become a grandfather, whatever it might be, or you've gone to a place that you want to travel to, etc. There's a satisfaction angle in there. And that's what refereeing gave me. Refereeing gave me a chance to do something that I'd been denied, I thought, in some ways, not being able to play the game. I could at least get out there and be on the field. I had that satisfaction that I participated in first grade football. I participated in the greatest game, as they call it, here in Australia. I was part thereof. The satisfaction and company of friends, the camaraderie of referees. As I said, we are somewhat forced to be together because we're the so-called enemy. You know, we're the ones that don't belong to a club, although we do have factions within our association, which area you come from, but we're all the great at referees, and we band together. And when you see photographs of us all together dressed in our gear, you start to realise how great a body of men you've got there. And I've got to say, perhaps now in this new age, men and women, haven't I, you've got there. But the thing is that you get that satisfaction from being able to see these people and know that you've gained from being in them. You've had the pleasure of their company. You've enjoyed experiences with them, and more so you've shared, because, you know, we're very tribal in our life. I mean, none of us, we talk about this lockdown now, how there's all this mental stress and drama. I personally don't feel it, and I can understand why I don't feel it, because at the moment I've got a comfortable lifestyle. I don't have the pressures of work, etc. I've got a lovely wife who keeps me company, and we do things together, and we're occupied. But there are others who don't have it, and that they could fall into mental stress as a consequence. But as a referee, you know, we're very tribal in the sense that we are a group of outsiders within the game. Players can change from club to club. You can be a South player this year, you can be a Canterbury player next year, a Broncos player the year after. And you get a recognition from a variety of sources all along the way. The referees are the referees. We're one singular body, and we all do one thing, and we don't change clubs. We're there, we're stuck with that situation. And as a consequence, as this camaraderie builds up and a sense of you belonged. And that's what I mean about this tribal thing, that anybody wants to belong. If you don't belong, you're on the outer. And refereeing gives you a chance to belong. And belonging with people who endure the same experiences you do, they endure the same hardships you do, they do the same job you do, everything, and all of these, the samenesses are there, and you've got this good company of fellows to do it with. And that's what I got out of refereeing, that satisfaction coming from there. And then I look back upon what did I achieve in refereeing. That's the next thing. But I look back more upon the satisfaction I got out of being a referee, and the actual achievements within then become, well, secondary to some extent, but not totally secondary. But the fact they did a grand final here and a grand final there, they're highlights of that career I've had. They're highlights. They're standout events within that period of time when I belonged. And that's the important thing to me, that sense of belonging.
Yep. We'll head into our fast five to finish. We might even make it 6. We'll add an extra one for you at the end. Barbecue or tomato sauce?
I think I like barbecue.
Okay. Ford or Holden?
Yeah, they're names from the past now, aren't they? Heavens above. I probably have to say Holden, a bit reminiscent of my career, born about the same time I was, so Holden.
Now, you've done both of these, State of Origin or Grand Final?
Yeah, it's difficult to say that. Yeah. What do I prefer? So if you ask me to rank them, I would probably say State of Origin's got to come first because of the intensity, the enthusiasm that surrounds it, all those vibes and activities, and your involvement. When you're out in that paddock and that crowd roars behind you, you feel that lift, and you're there, and you're doing what you have to do to make sure that game continues, and you're part of that entertainment, I suppose. The test match would probably be number 2, and I'd say I've got to rank the grand final as number 3, even though it's a busier time than the test match, because representing your country, which you do when you're doing a test match, has significance. Not many people can say they've got a blue, green and gold blazer, can they?
No. Now, you've been to plenty of these, beach or snow?
Definitely beach. Don't like snow. I mean, my recent trip we did to Antarctica, a lot of snow there, lovely stuff to look at, lovely stuff to see, but bloody good to get out of it. It's more pleasant to be on the beach. And so given the chance, I suppose, if I had to spend the rest of my life somewhere, it'd be on the beach. So I'm probably destined for hell, I suppose, where the warmth is rather than somewhere else.
Money or free time?
Free time. Free time is so significant. We live a very hurried life. Our lives have never been easy to live. We've always got something to do. We've always got family to look after. We've got house to look after, lawns to mow, and free time is so significant. The money can buy some things, but it's to get that money, you've probably got to put a lot of time in. And I honestly think the free time is significant, which has been proved recently with this coronavirus thing. And to me, there's a lot of free time for people. And I think a lot of families are re-establishing themselves as families a little bit now and getting to know each other more. And I do like that free time when you know that you can do what you want to do and not what has to be done.
And a supplementary 6th question for a school teacher. Tonight's discussion ranked out of 10.
You want me to mark myself? Oh, Daniel, that's very hard to mark myself.
9.5.
Enjoyed it. Well, I've enjoyed it. I hope what I've said has been valuable. I hope I haven't offended anybody. I'm a bit of warts and all sort of person. You know, I like to tell the truth because I think it's only fair. I mentioned that fact that's fair. As I said to you once in one of our previous conversations, I used to live by a philosophy in teaching. When a kid did something wrong to me, no matter how bad that kid was, I always try to get the idea across to the kid that, you know, it's not you I object to, it's your behaviour. And I'd like to think that whatever happens in life, be it good, bad or otherwise, it's part of the behaviour process from which we can all learn, we can gain experience and become better people. My dad wanted me to become a better person. I hope I have.
Yeah. Well, Barry, it's been very enjoyable chatting to you this evening. You've achieved a lot in the game and have articulated your story so very well. Again, for someone who I haven't had a lot to do with and haven't met in person, it's been a pleasure to chat with another gentleman of the game. Look after yourself, Jenny, and your family, and have fun catching up with the grandkids in the near future.
Thank you very much. And I hope, Daniel, we might be able to meet sometime in the near future. And I'll tell you what, I'll buy you a beer if I do.
Sounds good. Thanks, Barry. Have a good one.
Okay, mate.